Thanks everybody for this final part of the day. What we wanted to do in this part 3 is somewhat also bridging the discussion with regards to the performance measurement, and then also bringing some case studies and some broader view also with regards to the experience that has been in the time of UNETA. This will be a couple of presentations by, one by Adrian Griffin. We'll start with his presentation, then Andrea Mantovani will provide a presentation, and also then Professor Van Dijk, Walter Van Dijk, will actually, following all the discussions with regards to the leveraging of real-world evidence, provide some views on how this could be put into practice. So if we go on the next slide, just to provide what was discussed, also what is foreseen within the legislation with regards to the evaluation which was mentioned, is of course the aspect of by January 27 that the member states already need to report to the European Commission of how the joint work is actually considered in national HTA. But there also I think it's important indeed not only the JCA but also GSC, the AHT report, also voluntary corporations. So it will be interesting to see what type of measures could be taken in order to evaluate that, but also to look if methodological guidance has been considered at national level. So I think it will be important guidance or an important guide to see how these aspects are taken into consideration. And then indeed, as mentioned, by January 28, the reporting of the added value for member states of weather technologies, as well as the quality of the reports correspond to the needs. Also the aspect of the non-duplication of the requests, reducing administrative burden for member states, health technology developers, and this based upon the reports which were given. So most likely these are also important considerations in order to define the performance of the regulation on the HTA. If we go on the next slide, some other specificities for medical devices which could also provide an, a soft legal basis is with regards of that in all cases the work carried out under the regulation, in particular the joint clinical assessment, should aim at produce high quality, timely results, foster greater collaboration. So I think those points were already put forward. So it will be important that there is even a soft legal basis in order to put those measures forward. But also the aspect with not delaying or interfering with CE marking, delaying the market access. I think the other quite important measures in ensuring that the regulation is actually quite performant. And in generally, the work on the regulation on HTA should be separate and distinct from the regulatory impact, from the regulatory assessment, and have no impact on the decision taken in accordance to those regulations. I think another potential measure to be taken forward. But now I'd like to hand over to Adrian to give his view with regards to the regulation for medical devices and the consideration on previous experience. Adrian?
Thanks, Yves. I had some fairly simple messages when I prepared for today, but with the flavour of the conversation today, I've had to rewrite my notes. So apologies if I do keep pointing down occasionally. Next slide, please. I've split my. I was asked to give case studies, but clearly there have been no JCAs yet, and certainly not of medical devices. So what I've tried to do is look back over the previous experience, both within the collaborations under UNETA, but also real-world examples of HTA of medical devices, and try and align the two. So I've got three sections. Firstly, a couple of slides just on context for medical devices. I think we've talked about most of these today, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Then the experience, and then trying to finish on a positive, some proposals as how this could go forward. So next slide, and again. So first of all, just for context, and if you give me the next build, just for clarification between devices and drugs, okay? Healthcare systems spend about twice as much, roughly ballpark, on pharmaceuticals than they do on medical devices. I'm not claiming for more, I'm not whining, it's just a reality. That's the expenditure difference between pharm and devices. I couldn't find the number of EMA drugs, approved drugs, but there are about 20,000 FDA approved, so I'm assuming it's pretty similar in Europe, okay? The last time I asked MedTech Europe, there were over 500,000 medical devices on the market of varying, and that's all classes, but that includes class 2B and 3. The pharmaceutical industry also is made up of predominantly large and mid-sized companies, whereas the medtech industry is predominantly small and mid-sized companies. The industry representatives you have informing this debate today are not representative of the industry. We are the informed minority, and we come from large companies. So when this regulation goes live, the chances are the companies that are going through the JCAs initially have no recollection, have no awareness of it. And that's something that needs to be borne in mind. Likewise, the life of a branded medicine can be a decade. The life cycle of a medical device, if you're lucky, can be 2 or 3 years, because it iterates fairly rapidly. So then that raises questions around, are we reviewing a product, a branded line of products from a particular company, or a class of products? And that question also is something which we take very different perspectives on at different times. So the point here is that the context, that when we're talking about medtech, it's a very different perspective than pharmaceuticals. You've got many more products that are receiving much less spend. So the return on investment for a company, the business model works on a much smaller scale. So when we're thinking about evidence generation, we need to think about it in that perspective too. So a lot of the evidence generation on medtech happens post-licensing when it's actually achieved, and in collaboration with health systems or through registries, whereas for pharma, the model is very much more, it's developer-driven upfront in terms of RCTs. Next slide, please. So just following on that analogy between the two, they both have regulatory pathways. Stop there, please. Okay. They both have regulatory pathways at the EU level. It's centralized. Next bill, please. When we talk about reimbursement, on pharmaceuticals, it's systematic. It tends to happen at the national level before launch or in parallel with launch, and that, you know, and the price is set by an HTA process. Whereas with medical devices, in most markets, the device itself is not reimbursed. It's the procedure that is reimbursed. It's what the surgeon does. And that tends to be through something like an HRG or a DRG system. So the next couple of clicks, please. And so you find HTA is done at that launch stage. It's done in every market at the same time to inform that initial launch pricing and coverage decision. There is not that decision for medical devices. So when we're looking at copying and pasting what happens from a JCA for a pharmaceutical, it's pointless from a medical device perspective because HTA is done at a different stage. One more click, please. What we find in medical devices is HTA is done at the local level, and it's done to inform things like tenders. which tend to be much more price volume driven. So actually the HTA is around clinical practice. It's around service reconfiguration. It's very much more practically orientated and localized to that local context. Next slide, please. So my big ask here, when we're talking about the purpose of the JCA for medical devices, is we first of all need to think about what question we want to inform. Okay, what decision do we want to influence? Because it's not the same as pharmaceuticals, because we're not influencing a coverage decision at launch or a pricing decision. Next clip, please. So, and this goes back to my comment previously, we need to know why we're doing it before we work out how we do it. Because the chances are, the reason that why we're doing it will determine what the output looks like, okay? I'll come back to that later. I did have one slide here on evidence generation, and I think in the interest of time, I might pause, but just one key piece here. This was around evidence generation. This paper actually goes back to 2009. It was indeed in collaboration with Rosanna Taricone and Michael Drummond. It's still one of the most cited papers on evidence generation for HTA in medical devices, which is a bit concerning that it's 16 years old and still one of the most frequently cited papers. But just to one of the points that came up earlier around learning curve, one of the big challenges with medical devices, and there are 7 different issues that we highlighted, differences between pharma and devices. But one of the key ones was, even if you can do a controlled study, it comes back to the usability piece. If you're randomizing surgeons to the standard process that they've been doing for decades and a new technique, you're not actually possibly evaluating the effectiveness of the new device. You're actually evaluating the ability of the surgeon to learn a new technique compared to the experienced one. So you're actually comparing an inexperienced surgeon with an immature surgeon in that technique. So there are so many different issues that we need to consider in evidence generation. So let's talk about a little bit about experience. Now, the first medical device assessment wasn't even under Joint Action 2. It was back in 2006. The first HTA of a medical device that was done under the European collaboration was pre-joint actions. It was when UNETA had the first project. And the first one they did was on drug-eluting stents. Unfortunately for my age, I was partly involved in that one as well. So I have scars across the decades of European collaboration. But these were a number of the ones that they did under Joint Action 2. The key observation here, there are several. Firstly, these were done under the collaborative model of HTA collaboration. They weren't done as relative effectiveness assessments under UNETA, or what we would call joint clinical assessments under the regulation. These were done by agencies who did the work and asked companies, do you have any references? Do you have any evidence that you want to commit? There was not a mandated requirement for a company to invest in developing the submission. That's the first thing. The second one is look at the number of devices. They range from 1 to 6. The point here is you get competition in medical devices much more rapidly than you do in pharmaceuticals, because pharmaceuticals work by biological means. You have to find the molecule, do it through assays and in vitro studies to work out whether or not you can get a competitor to it. Medical devices predominantly work by physical means. It's a no-brainer. It's quicker to, if you build a bridge, Eves, tomorrow out of concrete or out of stone, I go, oh, that's a good idea. You've got the patent on stone. I'll build it out of wood. It's much quicker to get competition in the medtech space than it is in the pharmaceutical space. And so what you find in most of these examples is you had quick, even though these were very innovative at their time, competition came very rapidly afterwards. And so a lot of the reviews that were done were class reviews, not product specific. And so when we're doing JCAs, if we're doing product specific, we need to think about the unintended consequences on the first mover that then has knock-on implications for subsequent entries. And the other one is the time post-CE mark. In a lot of these, it was at least 3 years post-launch that there was evidence to actually do these, or that these became enough of a signal within healthcare systems that there was an interest in reviewing these. So one of them was done at launch, or two of them were at launch, but actually a lot of them were done a little bit after. And the next click, please. One we had under joint action 3, and another click, was actually done 13 years after launch. So this is a little bit probably extreme at the other end, but it goes back to that message. We went through the relative effectiveness assessment with UNETA because they wanted to do it. We're not quite sure why. 13 years after launch, it required us to redirect resource internally to resource this and to collect the evidence and to submit it. But it was unclear who it was for or what decision it was informing. The why was missing. It seemed to be an academic process to achieve an output for the project rather than actually inform decision makers in member states. Next slide, please. So that brings us on to UNETA 21, the most recent variation of it. They did a couple of joint clinical assessments, and these, interestingly, were very different from the previous ones. These were done at the time of launch. Two here, Optilume and Evoke. The key thing here is none of these companies are represented here. I don't believe either of them were part of MedTech Europe, so the European Device Association. So these companies went through this, probably didn't really know what they were doing at the stage, but also they're representative of the kind of companies that are going to be going through JCAs when it goes live, okay? They both used the evidence that was used as part of their CE marking, because it was done at the time of CE marking. The first one had a randomized controlled trial and 2 single-arm studies. UNETA asked for 3 PICOs, and the PICOs didn't align to any of the evidence, and so, it was like, sorry, no evidence. And the second one, again, 1 RCT. I think they also had 1 single-arm study or an observational study. Again, there were 3 PICOs requested from UNETA. The evidence kind of overlapped for 1, but not completely. And again, the outcome was not enough evidence. So, I think it kind of points to what question are we trying to answer. And if the issue is around we want evidence, we want to do these at the time of launch in parallel to the CE marking, because that's what we're doing on the pharma side. The outcomes are going to be fairly consistent in terms of, sorry, there's not enough evidence to justify the relative effectiveness, because we don't have relative effectiveness at that time in a product's life cycle of medical devices, because the business model is different. So we can talk about redefining the business model and making it a pharma business model, but then you'll have, 25,000 pharma companies all going for pharma-type revenues from medical devices. So, it's probably not going to be fit for purpose. So I think it's the point is we need to make sure that the output, what we're asking for from these JCAs, is fit for the business model that, as regulators, we've put on these companies. Next slide, please. And just before I move on to the recommendations, just 2 unintended consequences that we've seen from national HTAs in this perspective. One is where evidence from that first mover is extrapolated across a class. And I think most of the innovative companies here have probably experienced this. So you generate the RCT, you do the evidence generation. It takes ages to get it reimbursed because the markets are not working in similar fashions. But what you do is you launch, you fund the evidence generation, you get on the market, and then because the products are working by physical means, not biological, it's quicker for your competitors to come to the market. They go through a CE marking process and get equivalence. They then launch, and they go through the reimbursement process that I put up on the previous slide. They go to the local hospitals and say, you know, that device you're using from Medtronic that you're paying lots of money for, well, I've got one and I can give it to you for 30% less. And they'll say, well, where's your evidence? And I say, well, it's the same product, it's the same class, surely it works the same way. And procurement agencies go, how much is that discount? And all of a sudden, that product-specific evidence now relates to the class. And we've seen that through HTA agencies. You know, and the one that comes to mind was the first drug-eluting stents through NICE. Okay, the first time round, they gave branded recommendation to 2 products. Then they re-reviewed it a couple of years later. They actually then had evidence from 3 products, and they applied it to over a dozen. And the market fell out of the bottom of drug-eluting stents in the UK after that. And that goes down to the second point, which is the interplay between drivers of procurement and HTA. Because, you know, with pharma, you get a price through your HTA process. That price is pretty much predictable for your branded protected period of that product. The problem with medical devices is because competition comes so quickly, and it's quite quick to innovate, procurement are happy to renegotiate. And if the fast follower doesn't have that same evidence hurdle, then you've got a disincentive to be that innovator. You've got an incentive to be the fast follower, not do the investment in evidence, but just offer a little bit more of a discount to get you over that hurdle. Next slide, please. And I think, you know, it sounds as if I'm not complaining, I'm just presenting the realistic perspective of how the environment is working and the competing levers that as industry we have to play off, you know, between the different parts. If you can build that, thank you. So before I give my recommendations, firstly, a few cautionary considerations. I think the first thing is we need to recognize that difference, the different route to market between drugs and medical devices. And clarity on that why is really going to make the success of the regulation in the medtech space. It's going to be the difference between a success or an admin process that companies have to go through. I think on a very serious note also, this is likely to be an additional burden for medical device companies. Okay, I have one foot in each camp, and I know that our pharma side has line of sight to every product on our portfolio that's going to go through a JCA from now until, I mean, way out further than anyone in here is thinking, you know, over a decade, because that's how far our portfolio goes, and we can identify what's in scope and in what year. And we have teams that will be able to resource that. On a medical device side, we have probably a handful of market access people in Europe managing the whole portfolio of medical devices. They are separate companies, our pharmaceutical and our medical device businesses. They don't share resource. I am the one shared resource paid for by pharma, okay, because medtech doesn't have the money. But the reality is that most medtech companies may have 1 or 2 people in a country if they're a big medtech company. If they're a small medtech company, they've probably got 1 person in Europe or a consultant that they've got on their, you know, in their Filofax. And so where we're talking about reducing duplication and making things more efficient through the regulation from a pharma perspective, that doesn't translate to medical devices. This is going to be a new incremental step. And it's highly unlikely to replace anything that happens at a local level. Because in reality, when we look at HTA in medical devices, there aren't that many markets that do it systematically. Yes, if I'm going in France and I want a premium price and I want branded DRG, you know, then I have to go through an HTA process. It'll probably be 3 or 4 years after launch because that's when the evidence is available to go through it. Or in Germany, if I want to get reimbursement in the outpatient setting, I have to generate and do it. So the only overlap for me as a medical device company is if I've got a product that I can use in the outpatient setting and I want premium pricing in France, then that's where the Venn diagrams overlap. Okay? In most situations, you don't get that overlap. And most countries are requesting HTAs of individual devices at different times and to inform different questions. And so it's until the European regulation turns up and says, this is what we're going to do and this is why, as companies, we can't see reductions in effort in that piece. And I think just finally, we need to make sure that that JCA, therefore, doesn't introduce an unpredictable hurdle for the innovator. So if we're going through, and this is where we bring in the joint scientific consultations. So we've got the new MDR, which requires clinical evaluations. So that's great. That's then a hurdle for these Class 2B and Class 3 devices. But if I go for joint scientific consultation and the evidence request from the HTA agencies is more than I need to get through the notified body and the expert panels, then that's a first mover disadvantage, because the only company that's going to be requested from is the innovator. The fast follower, Eves & Co., who's following on 6 months down the line, is unlikely to have that hurdle. He'll just have the regulatory one. And so we need to make sure we've got consistency across the board for all generations. And I think, it needs to be finding a way to facilitate that access to innovations and supporting the SME nature of the businesses. Because at the end of the day, the likes of Johnson & Johnson and Medtronic and Edwards will find a way through. But the other SMEs in the industry, in Europe, won't. If they're one product and that product gets stuck in a JCA, then that's probably going to kill the business. Next slide. So a bit more positive. Recommendations. I think the key thing here is identifying the why will help define what that output should look like. And this is sort of leading on to sort of my next piece. The impact, as we've heard, if you get a medical device, the chances are it's an implant, particularly if it's a Class 3. You're going to live with it for the rest of your life, okay? There's no way I'm going to give you evidence when I get it CE marked of overall survival for 25 years. It just doesn't happen, which is why we need registries, which is why we need long-term follow-up beyond what's required for notified bodies. Okay. And so what we should be thinking about is not this checkbox exercise on let's compare its relative effectiveness to the standard of care at the moment. Let's find a way of actually facilitating that evidence generation in a systematic way over its life cycle and setting a framework that the fast followers, the Eves & Co., then can join in with and build on, okay? And that would then help maintain the SME nature of the industry. It will help set those evidence standards and expectations over time. It can support coverage with evidence generation or managed entry schemes if that's required. And really, we're talking about AI at the moment. That's everything that's out there. All we need to do this is an electronic patient record and utilize the UDIs that we've just created for these products. It's not rocket salad. And then down the line, we can have a bit of a conversation around when we do these JCAs, are these product specific or are they class specific? And there's probably scenarios for both when they work. So I think I have one slide left. So, in conclusion, this is a quote that basically said, the HTA cooperation could provide guidance to facilitate this post-launch evidence generation. It would recognize the differences for the medical device technologies and the timeline of generation. It would also work that supports the SME nature of the industry and provide a level playing field for the first mover and subsequent followers. This quote is actually taken from our first response to the regulation, which we submitted back in January 2017. So our view has not changed. We have been consistent in our messages to this regulation since day one, and we hope that it evolves in that general direction. I think I'm pretty much spot on. I apologise, I've gone a couple of minutes over.
Great. Well, thanks, Adrian.